Hello and welcome to the Exponential Australia Church Leaders Podcast. We are so glad that again you would join us as we've been hearing from a wide range of leaders both within Australia as well as around the world. And I'm particularly looking forward to today's podcast as we are joined by Mindy Caliguire. Mindy is the founder and president of Soul Care. She is the author of several books. And she also has a very wide range of experiences across particularly the US church in her involvement with Stadia, as well as historically being involved with the Willow Creek Association. So Mindy, we are so glad that you would join us all the way from Colorado.
Well, thank you, friend. I'm delighted to be with you all the way very early in the morning in Sydney.
It's an absolute joy to be able to reconnect. And Mindy, we were recently in a room of about 100 pastors from Australia and New Zealand at the Exponential Global Conference. You were joining us as part of your connection with Stadia. And it was just so great to have a whole range of leaders hearing as part of your session, particularly around soul care. And I wonder, just for those who maybe have joined us today on the podcast, who are hearing your name for the first time, not sure of kind of the part of the church that you join us from, maybe you just give us a bit of a broad strokes overview of some of your involvement.
Yeah. I've had a lot of different ways of involvement in local church ministry over many years. Just to sort of summarize or put some high points out there. My husband and I met in college, got involved in the campus ministry that was highly evangelistic and discipleship focused. And then in going to, when he was at seminary, it became convinced that the local church was God's plan A, where discipleship and evangelism was supposed to actually happen. And back when we were in college and everything, it would have been like the last place you ever thought of was the local church for either of those things, which I hate to say, and I'm sure we had a very arrogant and small-minded view, but the church was not where you would look. And then we learned church planting was actually one of the places where evangelism was happening and discipleship, which many of you, I'm sure, know. And then we realized that there was a church in the Midwest here in the US called Willow Creek Community Church, maybe you're familiar with it, that was doing a church planting internship to help people understand how to learn from the way they had built Willow Creek at that time. We're talking the early 90s. Willow Creek was only 15 years old at the time. And so my husband and I both became interns at this church planting internship. And at the end of 1 year, we went off and just prayerfully said, God, where are we going? And we started a church in Boston, Massachusetts, which in the US is on the East Coast and the Northeast and has probably a very similar spiritual climate to much of what I understand Australia is like. It's not the Bible Belt of the South here in the States. And so we started our own church, did a hard thing. It's shout out to all you church planters. It was a hard thing in a hard place, at least in a US context. And we did it in the hardest possible way. There was no Stadia. There was no Exponential. We had no coaches. We had no help. We just were out there doing it on our own. I think they call it a parachute drop church plant into a city. And so we ended up staying there for 10 years. And much of what I care about with soul care came out of a pretty severe crisis of my own soul during that time. And we can talk more about that. But in terms of my involvement with church ministry, since then, we were 10 years doing church planting in Boston. Then I moved back to Willow Creek, had the invitation to work in spiritual formation with John Ortberg there. He was the teaching pastor for a time. And so I was on the staff with Willow at the church, and then I became a member of the staff of the Willow Creek Association sometime later. And so that was in that season was when I was doing more things with Australia, with the Willow Creek Association in Australia. Very lovely to visit and do some ministry there. And then my work with the Willow Creek Association, helping churches think about the topic of transformation and inspired by the body of data called Reveal. And there was a lot, I think, of churches in Australia as well that did Reveal. So I was helping them think about strategy of how are you helping people find their life in God as a part of your discipleship path and all that stuff. So we would talk about that. And then I moved out to Boulder, Colorado. I was invited to join the leadership of an emerging technology company out here called Gloo. It has done a ton of things with churches and whole networks of churches. And And then in the wake of the pandemic, I began doing more things directly with soul care and left my role with Gloo, although we're still really good friends. And I'm doing a lot more directly with churches now with soul care, providing services, vision, a variety of things. And then the one other thing I'll mention is during this time when I was invited to join the board of Stadia, I was also serving on the board of our local church. So I was, for the first time, not working at a church or around a church, and started attending a church, which was a whole new thing after you've been in church leadership for your whole life. And then I was invited to join the board of that and served for about 6 or 7 years on the board, eventually as the chair of the board before it was my turn to step down and make space for some new leaders. So anyway, I've had a lot of different roles with the local church, and, you know, it's still God's plan A. It is how evangelism, discipleship, care for the needy, that's the local church is where it's at. It's amazing. So anyway, that's my background there.
Amazing, Mindy. Well, there's some incredible high level, experiences that you've had. I imagine both highs and lows, like just incredible experiences. And referencing your time coming to Australia, you're always welcome back. We'd love to have you back.
Tim and I are already talking. So he tells me 24 might be what I'm looking for. So
glad to hear that. I wonder if you would dive into that, I guess, that kind of that part of your life where soul care became so important. Of course, I'd love you to talk about what soul care has become as an organization and what you do now.
Yeah.
Particularly, where did that come from? And I guess as part of our conversation today, how can the church orientate itself around spiritual formation and be characterized by leaders that are spiritually formed? And I know that always starts in somebody's story. And so maybe you could tell us that part of your story and then kind of help us to unpack that.
Happy to share it, Charlie. And it's like our stories are everything, right? That's how God woos us, shapes us, invites us into his work in the world. And it's true of me, just like it is everyone who's listening. So for me, those midway through those 10 years in Boston, I had a pretty serious collapse of my own interior, and it resulted in some significant neurological symptoms that we didn't know if they would get better. We didn't know what it was. I was pregnant at the time with our second son, and had to be hospitalized several times because I just kept going into premature labor because baby is going like, isn't that a good place to be in here? Time to go. And so thankfully he made it full term and he's fine today. But it was very disorienting to me. I remember feeling like the bottom had fallen out of everything I thought I knew about what it meant to be a follower of Jesus, about what it meant to be a worker or somebody who was doing ministry as their vocation. And like, I seriously remember telling God, like, this was not strategic. Like, I had so much work that needed to get done. This is not strategic for me to be puking my guts out days on end, laying in bed. And it started a lot of deep conversations with God during that time. And there's a lot of things I could say about that. I don't know exactly where you'd want to go, but it was truly out of that season that I actually abandoned any sort of commitment to leadership per se, or a life of service to the organization of the church. And instead it was more like, I need to figure out how to care for my own soul, and out of whatever healthy looks like, and I'm not healthy right now, but whatever healthy looks like eventually, God can just do through me whatever he well pleases. I'm done trying. I got to a point where I was so done being strategic and intentional and all those things that we sort of grab onto and sometimes hear this calling from God, and then we run off and be like, hey, I got it. Now we go and do the thing. And I had done that pretty destructively, self-destructively. And so I was like, I'm not going to do that anymore. I don't really know any other thing, but I have to figure out, and I didn't even know what the soul care, I wouldn't have known what that was. I didn't know it was, good Lord, I had no idea what spiritual formation was. I just knew I wasn't living the life that Jesus apparently made available. And so I, thank God, was surrounded by authors and mentors and friends and advisors and therapists and other people who are in 12-step recovery, who were helping. They're part of my community, but they were helping me come to see a completely different way of living, of caring for my soul as my first priority, and then letting everything else that I'm responsible for flow from that place of overflow rather than trying to give and lead out of deficit. And so I had no intention of starting anything called soul care. I had no intention of any of what has happened since. I just was resolved that I needed to build as deep a relationship in real time, not truths about God. I needed to build as deep a real-time relationship with God as I could, and that he could do through me whatever he wanted. And I was done. As I said, I had this pretty profound refusal. I'm not going to go back to all that crazy drivenness, which was what had helped me succeed in academics. It had helped me succeed in business, and it had helped me succeed in the early years of the church plant. But the cost is severe, and this is a great title of a book that's unrelated in its contents, but a great title. It becomes an adventure in missing the point. And I think that's what a lot of us in ministry end up with, is we are working hard. We know how to work hard, and we know how to ramp up the fear and drive and angst and the pressure. And we know how to do all that. And as a result, we are just killing ourselves so that we can bring a message of life to other people. It just gets a little goofy after a while. Hopefully more and more people are coming to their senses around that. But I know for me, it took, I had a complete collapse of my interior and could not function. Yeah.
Mindy, what would you say to a leader or leaders who are, potentially feeling in a similar situation as you were, particularly maybe they haven't got to that point of the bottom completely falling out, and yet they can see some of the signals, some of the big signs, and even to go a step further, even this sense in which I don't know how to reorientate my life in this certain direction with this. You're obviously part of a church that is highly recognized around the world for, for its effectiveness. And that would have been a challenging situation for you. But even for others in local church ministry, where you feel like you've got to make this thing go around, how were you able to differentiate yourself from that in order to care for your soul?
Well, the good news for, I hope, all of us is once you do begin that differentiation and start with a pretty fierce resolve, committing to your own soul's well-being, it becomes easier and more natural, and the Lord helps you in navigating the more complex leadership environments that I do believe we're called to. I do not want people to, this is what I would say now. Do you guys say pissed off and nobody gets mad?
We'll allow it.
I don't want people to get so pissed off at their church and the overwork and resentment that we abandon the church and then go write books about solitude and silence and all that kind of stuff. But we have to, I love that stuff is happening. We need authors and leaders to go do that. Yeah. But I'm who's going to stay and help this mess become what it could be? And so the good news is, all I'm saying on this is, once you make that commitment in your life to live out of health and not to move out of overdrive, which is a pretty hard thing. And we can go back to, what does that moment and that season look like? But I want to give everyone high confidence that God with you, you can navigate even the most conflicted leadership environments that exist out there. And I hope that many of you will. If you're called to leave, by all means do. But if you can stay and get the support of our organization or the ones that are in Australia, or there's all over the world, there's organizations that are coming around leaders to provide help and support so that our organizations can over time become more healthy. Because the reality right now is many of our cultures, even in wonderful, highly effective ministries are quite toxic to the souls of the people that work there. And that's like a thing we don't like saying out loud, but it's true. And I'm working with enough of those organizations. I've been part of the insanity, I'm sure, and enough of them. And it just doesn't have to be that way. And culture change is a slow slog, but it can happen, and it does. And we really must. Okay. So anyway, back to this like moment. How would you, the biggest thing I would say, guys, if you are in a place where you're like, oh man, I'm barely catching my breath between Sundays. I am barely able to give the very, very minimal leftovers of whatever my energy is to my kids or my spouse, whatever that is. First of all, I would say, pay attention to those symptoms. Pay attention to that fatigue. Pay attention to that loss of vitality, like whatever language you want to put around it. I think of them as symptoms of soul neglect, and nobody sets out to trash the well-being of their soul, especially nobody in vocational ministry, but it happens. We get running and gunning, and life gets hard, and we forget about God, and then we forget that we forgot, and we've led a whole new sermon series. We planted 2 more campuses. We've done all this stuff, but we've lost that sense of God is with me and God is for me. And when we've disconnected that way, there will be utterly predictable symptoms in our life and our soul. And it'll come from all a different range of personhood. It'll come from your emotions, your thoughts, your physical body, like mine was. It'll come from all these different places. But those are just the symptoms. And they're just pointing to this disconnection, a deeper disconnection that we easily fall into, and that Jesus knew we would, and has no shame and anger at us, but it's just a constant invitation to return, to come back. So anyway, the first thing I would say is begin to pay attention, and like whether you do that in the pages of a journal, or you have a mentor or a friend, a spiritual friendship that is a safe place that you can talk about that kind of stuff, you got to start putting words around it and acknowledging, okay, I am diminished, and this is what that looks like for me. So paying attention, and really it's a way of honoring your own journey and your life. So that's just like one example of something that I think is important. If you're listening to this and you're like, wow, maybe that's me. We have some assessments and things like that I can share with you that might be helpful to folks, but sometimes you just kind of know, you just don't want to admit it. And it's a good thing to sort of say, yep, this is me today. And it doesn't mean God isn't God. It doesn't mean it will always be this way, but you have to be honest about how you actually are right now.
Yeah. So good, Mindy. Mindy, when I first came across some of your work a number of years ago, I think I just stumbled upon like a YouTube video, and it was this brilliant idea of, what are you bringing to the table as a Christian leader? And particularly for one such as yourself, who has such a broad range across the church in the West, working with church planters on, board of advisors, all sorts of wonderful things that you do. I wonder if you would comment with relation to that question, particularly when it comes to being church planters, like for those who are church planting and maybe setting out, and as you've said before, running and gunning, try to get started, do all they can. Yet that is a very framing question of what are we actually bringing to people? What are we actually bringing to the table?
Yeah. I can walk through the illustration. I can also tell you the backstory of how it came to me, which is
I'd love to. Yeah.
And I think many people will identify with this, or anybody who does a lot of public speaking or communication. I was walking a group of people who were highly administrative leaders. It was probably 70 to 100 people on the staff of a large organization who'd run the accounting and the air conditioning and all of the operational stuff. And I walked them through this, I thought really, inspired diagram about spiritual formation and all these things. And I looked out at the end of drawing this whole thing out, citing all my Bible verses and everything. And you could tell I had just lost them. Charlie, they were gone. It was the worst feeling. And I'm just like, oh man, I'm terrible at this. What am I going to do? And I must have somehow prayed that, God, what am I going to do? And this idea dropped into my head. and I'll walk you through it. And I was like, all right, guys, you all work on teams, right? And they're like, yeah. And I said, do you use that metaphor of what different people bring to the table? And of course they all did. I think that's pretty common in Australia too, right? You'd be like, oh, somebody brings leadership to the table, somebody brings administration, somebody brings creativity. And as everybody brings what they uniquely bring to the proverbial table, what's on the table is the work that you're doing together. And as everybody brings what they bring, the work can go forward. So we all understand that metaphor. And so I said to them, basically this process, this lifelong process of soul replenishment, if you wanted to think about the 23rd Psalm, or spiritual formation of who we're becoming, all of these things are projects that you could say are on the table. Yeah. And I'm going to use your name, Charlie, because I don't know anyone else's. So now we're going to say, this isn't theoretical anymore. We're going to say what's on the table is Charlie, 2 years from now, more formed into the image of Christ than he is today. Yeah. And we have to, first of all, so do we believe that that's possible? Do we believe that that work could happen? And you look like a nice guy. I'm sure you're lovely in all these ways. But what I know about human nature, it would suggest that true of you and me and anyone listening is that there is a version of us that is more bold or more grace-giving, more compassionate, more courageous, whatever it is, that's more like the person of Jesus than we are right now today. Yes, we believe that is possible 2 years from now. And that if that 2 years from now thing is going to happen, there's two chairs at this table, this metaphor that we're talking about. One of those chairs is for God, and one of those chairs is for you. And if we're talking about what does God bring to the table, well, wow, that's a pretty big idea. What doesn't God bring to the table, right? And I love asking groups this, and they'll say all kinds of things. He brings a vision for your life. He brings circumstances. He brings all these things. But the one I'm always listening for is power. And this is key. This is key. Church planters, any kind of ministry leader, only God actually has the power to shift and reshape who we are at the core of our being. That is true at salvation. That is true the rest of our lives. Only God has that power. So God sits in this chair. How often? Well, all the time, 24/7, 365, God is sitting in that chair. And God is not sitting in that chair kind of cross-armed and tapping his toe, just a little miffed that you're not quite as godly as you should be. That is not God's posture. So God's here all the time with all the power of the universe to bring toward your formation, toward restoring life into your soul. It's kind of a big idea. Okay. Yeah. And he's not ticked. He's psyched. Yeah. So this other chair, though, Charlie, my friend, is for you and for each of us. Okay. That's for you. And you would ask the question then, well, what does Charlie bring to the table in order for this version of him 2 years from now to be realized? And it's not a very impressive list. Nothing, sorry. Yeah, it's not impressive. It's openness, it's yieldedness, it's surrender. And truly, compared to the resident power of the universe, the one who holds all things together, this is not very impressive. But this is the catch. Bring it, we must. And bring it, you must. You must show up at that table. You must sit down and bring that openness, that yieldedness, that surrender, or that beautiful picture of formation and soul restoration does not move forward. And it's not that God's being mean-spirited. It's just he is a respecter of persons. God is a respecter of persons that does not move into the human soul uninvited. And that's true. We know at salvation, and that is true for the rest of our lives. And what that then means is that it is vital for us to build this kind of sitting down at a table like that. This is metaphor, of course. We need to build that into a way of life, not out of legalism, not out of drivenness, not out of fear, but out of a longing and a belonging. When we learn to sit down, and many of us, we don't have the first clue how to sit down and just be with God in a way that's open, unagendaed. we know how to go do things for God. We know how to learn things about God. We know how to teach other people about God, but to learn how to rest our soul in God's presence, open to what he's doing at a level below words in our own lives. Well, we have to start talking, learning from the mystics and from a bunch of other people that have come a long time before us. This is not a new concept.
Yeah.
But much of our driven ways of engaging our discipleship that has emerged over the last, say, century, all well-meaning, I'm sure, but has had the effect of us, figuratively speaking, we sort of come into the room where this table and these chairs are sitting, and we enter into the faith and we start running that race that's marked out for us. And that's awesome. And we should, and we're made for that contribution and leadership and service and all that. But we just run right past this table all the time, this constant open invitation. And when we do, sometimes we slap God a high five, like, woohoo, this is so fun, love doing this work, right? And then we just do another lap, and then we do another lap. And then sometimes we've been running those laps for years. And we don't understand, why are we so tired? And God never intended for us to be running that race apart from him.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's how the metaphor came about. That's how I ended up explaining it to that precious group of people. And it has been used many times in many places ever since. And I find it's helpful because we think about spiritual formation, we think about spiritual practices as another thing I'm supposed to go do.
Yeah.
And I think it's just the enemy's great strategy to keep us busy and disconnected from God. Like, I think it's true that you could run, sticking with that metaphor, you could burn through a 45-minute quiet time and never actually sit down. You could burn through 6 hours of an 8-hour day-long retreat and never sit down. But sometimes you need those first 6 hours for your soul to get quiet enough that by the end of the day, you actually can sit down. Because many of us, we've just been running and running and running, and we do not know how to get slow and be quiet.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was very long-winded, but
thanks I love every part of that response, Mindy, and what it called. And I recognize that this is ironic, given, often the tendency in the Western church is to be highly pragmatic and to go, how do I make this work? But I guess just briefly, where have you been able to see, maybe it's with your involvement with Stadia or just in other areas of the church, where have you been able to see this really cultivated well in the life of particularly church planters? Because there is that elusive temptation of work harder, do more, get this thing going.
Mm-hmm.
Where have you been able to see, and maybe it's, it's anecdotal, but like, where have you been able to see church planters really set out from the outset to be able to make this part of their rhythm, their habit, to be able to be at the table?
I do know of some that sort of failed the traditional church planting assessment thing and said, well, we don't care if we failed according to you, we're going to go plant anyway. And they started the whole thing from a place of deep rhythm, deep life. Maybe that's not the best thing to tell your team, but I do think there have been some beautiful examples of this. And I know of several churches that are larger organizations that are actively planting, that are embedding these unforced rhythms of grace into their routines, holding their team to Sabbath, holding their team to sabbatical, embedding this stuff into their HR policies. And I think that's a very good thing. I've seen great examples of pastors and leaders and even church planters sort of refusing the drivenness. Are you going to have full days? Yes. Are you going to have a very full schedule? I have a very full schedule. Many of us are very high capacity leaders, and that can be done out of the overflow, or it can be done out of striving. It's not you can never look at the capacity somebody's operating at and understand or judge where that's coming from unless you ask and talk to them. I guess you could see if their life tends to be marked by love and joy and peace and patience. But generally speaking, we can't judge that. It's an inside game. We need to know that for ourselves. But it's not like if you slow down enough to sit at that table, receive from God what God's going to do. What if he's got 10 different ideas for you that you would never have had on your own? Yeah. What if there's an acceleration? What if he thinks you're going slow, but you're just going in your own strength? What if, who knows what the living God wants to say to you about all this stuff? But as long as we're driven out of our ego, we're driven out of proving, out of performance, out of fear, there's so many motivations that we have that keep us just running. And so I've known individual leaders, and I've known increasingly leaders of networks who are trying to say, how do we make this not just like a nice to have, but like an imperative of what it means to live and lead around here. And but I will say culture change is very slow. There's one large global organization I've been working with that I would say this year they're 10 years into an intention to change. And I mean, they're big. They've got thousands of people. And so, but they are 10 years in, and they are seeing, I'm hearing reports from people at all different levels of the organization that it's starting to shift what it feels like to work there, which is so encouraging. I wish it were fast and immediate. Certainly God can do a miracle, but generally we need to learn new ways. And I would say pragmatically, and there's nothing wrong with being pragmatic. I think God is intensely pragmatic. It's like, okay, how does this show up? What do we actually do? And I think I might have shared this when we were in Exponential, but there's a 3-part framework that we've been using a lot with our team, and certainly signals and draws from much prior work over centuries. But kind of 3 main things for leaders to hold in mind if you want to live and lead from a healthy place, which I can't commend to you enough. The world needs more and more leaders who are giving and leading out of overflow, as I mentioned. So those 3 things, if you want to keep them in mind, is you need to have a page, a person, and a plan. A page is an invitation to reflection. A person is an invitation to connection. And a plan is an invitation to intention. And all 3 of these matter tremendously in our discipleship. They matter a ton. A page, we need places to get quiet and kind of figure out what is going on in our head and how am I really? The kind of reflection that I was talking about earlier. What are the symptoms of my soul right now? And what does that mean? And then secondly, the connection. We all need a safe third space that's not our employer, it's not our family, a place where we can be honest about the good, the bad, and the ugly. Could be a spiritual director, could be a coach, could be any number of kinds of relationships, but we need that. There's a great saying in 12-step communities. I don't know if this would be familiar to you. I think it's pretty global. But they say we're only as sick as our secrets. Wow. And there's a lot of leaders who are stuck in some pretty toxic stuff that they have no safe place to talk about. And until you find a place to talk about it, you can't walk away. You can't get out. And for God's sake, and I mean it in all the ways that's meant, for God's sake, please do find that safe third place. And then the plan is really like, we think about in spiritual formation, we talk about a rule of life, which is the same, term as a regula or a trellis, a structure to support growth. It's not the same as the growth. It doesn't cause the growth, but without it, certain things that fruit or flower in a certain way can't be maximized. They just sort of crawl on the ground and don't ever really mature. And in order for us to mature, we need some structure to grab onto, some rhythms of rest, of Sabbath, of quiet, of engagement, of whatever it is, things that help us sit at that table. That if we're not intentional about it, it's just, you're not going to float downstream into this or anything else that matters. So anyway, that's what I would leave people with in terms of practical. Like, can you pull out a journal and reflect? Can you find a safe third person or create a relationship like that? Can you create a plan for your intentionality around this? And that's what I think is practical.
A page, a person, and a plan. And we won't dive into it now, but at that gathering that we were at together, you used a brilliant throwaway line that has stuck with me, and maybe it's for our listeners today as well, that your your leadership is capped at your ability to reflect. I just thought that was such a brilliant line, and it's really taken root in my life. I'm sure we could go down a different rabbit hole with that one right now, but I do want to bring us to our last question, Mindy.
Yeah.
Which I just felt like the Spirit prompted, and if there's anyone out there who I'm sure, and many would, but who has experienced a great degree of disappointment and discouragement in ministry, it seems like a bit of a strange way to end our podcast today, but feeling like as a source of encouragement, maybe you would just reflect upon some of the ways that you've been able to handle disappointment and bring that before the Lord, definitely not in a one-off, but in a process, a reflective process that has led to soul care and health. And
I would say, guys, I do totally get disappointment on many levels. Okay. There's a lot of things that can go wrong and very wrong in our lives and very painful that leave you going, God, what is up with this? What am I supposed to do? And I would say for me, one of the most difficult thing is like, you can handle a disappointment and another disappointment and another disappointment. You're resilient. You're church planters. Of course you can handle that. But when you experience what I called chronic disappointment, it is heavy. It is a very heavy load, whether it's on a family issue or church and ministry or financial, any number of things that become a source of chronic disappointment. That's when we are quite vulnerable. And it is also when we most need to learn to rest our souls in God's presence, in God's care. When the wheels are falling off, when all hell is breaking loose and you have no idea where to turn or what to do. Learning to be silent. And for me, silent prayer is the very specific practice that has been so keeping to my soul through these seasons of really hard circumstances. And the psalmist, in Psalm 131 and verse 2 says, I've stilled and quieted my soul like a weaned child or a contented child on its mother's lap. Yeah. And learning how to quiet your mind, learning how to rest in God's presence in silence. So I think the definition is a silent way of resting in the presence of God with an attitude of openness, contrition, and longing. And man, that longing word is really strong when we're faced with circumstances that are chronically disappointing. Yeah. We have a longing for resolution. We have a longing for peace. We have a longing for something to be different. And we don't demand it. We don't demand the result. We don't get to, we might be in a season like Psalm 88, where the last word of the Psalm is, darkness is my closest friend. Like that is a hard psalm to read. That is a psalm of anguish, and might be helpful to you in an odd way. Sometimes it's helpful to engage with that voice and recognize that it's in the Bible because it's part of the full human experience, and it's okay to talk to God about how you're feeling when it all is falling apart. Yeah. So I do think God brings a connection for us into the unseen realm that is where we need to be putting our deepest anchor.
Wow.
The seen realm is our finances and our core team and our marketing and our all that. But the unseen realm is where we fundamentally operate. And God is still God. He's still got a pretty good grasp on his purposes in our world, even if short-term or even long-term, those are very disappointing realities for us. I need regularly, like daily, to anchor in a wordless way to the presence of God and those unforced rhythms of grace. And yeah, that's I guess what I would say. Yeah.
Good. Well, Mindy,
be gentle with yourself in that place.
Yeah.
Be gentle.
Yeah. So good. Well, Mindy, we have so appreciated your time today. It's been an absolute gift. We've covered a wide range of areas and topics, and just the way that you bring us back to being with Jesus and to Yeah, it's been an absolute gift to our listeners today. So we just wanted to say an enormous thank you. Thank you for being with us. We hope that you will join us in Australia in the years to come. Thank you so much for your time today.
Loved it. Great to be with you guys. Take good care. Visit us at soulcare.com if there's anything we can do to help you.
So good. Thanks, Mindy.